If you ever wondered what worship is all about, it has two dynamics to it. One obviously is, as we're going to talk about today in the third of the series on being a bondslave of God, we are directing all of our attention away from ourselves to the one that we love, or even more importantly, to the one that loves us, as we heard. The second dynamic is that there is a cleansing action that goes on during worship, if we allow it to. We come in, we all carry a lot of things into a church service. And what worship does is begins to cleanse the heart, it begins to cleanse the mind, and even sometimes the memory of unpleasant things that maybe have transpired in the days, weeks, or even moments before we arrive here. So worship is so important. It's not entertainment. It's not us enjoying a band, although we do. It is us together, coming together, giving our allegiance and our thanks to the one who loves us, allowing our hearts to be cleansed. Because when that happens, then something happens with the ears. The ears hear better. The ears aren't clouded. The ears aren't stopped up. And we hear something for us, not just words. We are just people. I am just a guy. Nothing special. We are just God's people who desperately want to have ears that are open to hear what he has to say. So as Jesus said, they can sink deeply down into our hearts and change our lives. That's the purpose of worship. And we want to continue to teach ourselves and teach each other how important that is. So thank you for the worship team being so sensitive, not only in their preparation, but in their music this morning. We really, really appreciate that. We are in part 3 of the series that Pastor Kelly started 3 weeks ago. And the title series is Doulos. Maybe you've been here, not been here for the whole series. Maybe this is your first time, second time. So we want to just do a little reiteration so you understand where we're coming from. The Greek word doulos, D-O-U-L-O-S, means slave. Now what I want you to do is very, very important that you take all the negative connotations about slavery out of your mind. Political slavery, the stain on American culture, what goes on around the world today in varieties of forms of human slavery. Please take those and move them over here because they don't fit in what we're talking about. That's very important because we tend to relate things to what we know or have heard. And so that is super duper duper important that you do that. All the negative connotations, please dismiss them. Secondly, I'm going to relate back to Pastor Kelly's series on discovering God, which for me personally, probably one of the most important series I've heard in a while. And then last week he asked me to fill in for him today. And so I had already started preparing, a couple weeks ago actually, and about 25-30% of what he shared last week I had already been studying. So I'm going to launch off that and take us back a little bit to the discovering God as well, because if we are going to view ourselves properly as servants, more properly bondslave, more accurately slaves of the Most High God, then we need to have some understanding of who our master is. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, the master-slave relationship. For review and to help some of you catch up to speed if you have not been here, we've already given you the Greek word doulos. It means slave, it means bondman, someone in a condition of servanthood. More accurately and metaphorically in the New Testament, it is one who gives himself up to another's will. That's very important this morning. One who gives himself up to another's will. One who is devoted to another to the disregard of his or her own interests. Now, it's as Pastor Kelly said last week, it's the most common term applied to a Christian in the New Testament. It's pretty amazing. We're called a lot of things, but the most common thing is we are called doulos, or slaves, bond slaves, if that is a little easier for you to swallow. So it applied to us, but it also applies at least one time, and the most important time, to Christ himself. It's not the only word, it's not the most common word, but it is the word that is used that will set the foundation for all that he did and all that he said. Everything rests upon this title that the scriptures give Jesus Christ. If you have a Bible, open up to Philippians 2:7. We will have it for you on the screen. But come September, you're going to see less and less verses on the screen and more. We're going to ask you to either open a paper Bible like the old days, or if you have digital Bible, whatever. We hope to fill the pews with Bibles so we can say, turn to page 825. Make it easy for you. So so get ready for that change. We're sort of moving towards that now. But we'll have it on the screen for you this morning. So again, we're talking about the character relationship that a slave has to the master. Philippians 2:1-8. This is a very rich theological passage. I'm not going to get into the meat of that. That's not my intent this morning. I'm going to bring up nuances that help explain things. But we're going to start with this passage because it tells the story the best, I think. Is there any encouragement from belonging to Christ? Any comfort from his love? Any fellowship together in the Spirit? Great questions, aren't they? Are your hearts tender and compassionate? Then make me truly happy by agreeing wholeheartedly with each other, loving one another, and working together. I love these words, one another, together, with one mind and purpose. Don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of yourselves as better than thinking of others as better than yourselves. Verse 4, don't look out only for your own interests, but take an interest in others too. Now verse 5, the first 4 verses are a backward reflection of verses 5 through actually 9 and 10, but I don't have 9 and 10 on here. And so the first 4 verses are a reflection of this attitude that Christ had. You must have the same attitude or mindset that Christ had. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a what? What's it say on the screen? Slave. Okay? Servant. You can use that word, but slave is more accurate. And was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, verse 8, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on a cross. Now, this is everything that Jesus said and everything that he did, and how he relates to you and I is referenced to this verse passage right here. When Jesus emptied himself of his prerogative, or he chose not to use his divine privileges, I'm going to make up a word, his godness. I don't know if that's a word, but we'll use it. Godness, his divinity. In order to take on the existence of a human, he not only just became a man, but he took on the form of a slave, a doulos. And when he became flesh and blood, that apprehension of humanity deliberately resulted in a humanity or a person that exercised total dependence on his Father. That's the example. He wasn't a God hidden in a shell of human flesh. He wasn't like you and I. If we are Christians, we have God in us. It's not that idea at all. Paul didn't say that God was disguised as a man. First service we said it's not perpetual Halloween. Who is he really? And Paul did not say that Jesus only appeared as human and when it was convenient. And then when times got tough, he would sort of regather all his divine prerogatives and become divinity, or use his divinity again, not become, but use his divinity again to manipulate himself through a situation. None of that is implied here. What is implied here is that this man emptied himself to become like us. No other man has ever done that. No other man has been perfectly obedient. Was he tempted like we are to go our own way? You bet. But we learn in Hebrews that even though he was tempted, not one time did he physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally sin or rebel against the will of the Father. Not one time. He was a unique man. This is very important. You say, I know all that, please. I'm going to keep it in context. This is so vitally important because our perspective of the master that we serve is so important here. He was a unique man, totally dependent upon his Father, without personal rights and without personal purposes. In Hebrews chapter 10, this is not on the screen, verses 5 through 7, the writer says this, a body was prepared for me. This is like Jesus talking. A body was prepared for me, and I have come to do your will. Remember what we said back up in the definition? One who gives himself up to another's will, devoted to the other's interest at the disregard of his own. I have come to do your will as it is written in the scriptures. Well, where's it written? Well, back in Psalm 40, verse 6, the writer says this, God, you don't delight in sacrifices, meal offerings, sacrifices, burnt offerings, or sin offerings. You don't delight in those. So you have fitted me with a body. You have fitted me. That's where these two verses come together. What is it saying here? That Jesus' humanity guarantees that he knows my weaknesses. Guarantees that he knows my temptations, our limitations, our fears, our failures, our pain, our confusion, all these things that are wrapped up in the human experience because he became the slave man, if I can use that term. He knows. That's why he's the Savior. That's why he's the master. He sets the pattern to do the will of God. Now we have a dear man that comes to church here. There's terrible lights right there, so I can't see anybody in the back row. I'm looking to see if he's here. I don't see him this morning. Okay. Pat Giantomaso. Most of you know Pat Giano. He has a lovely saying that I enjoy. He calls this relationship that Jesus has with his Father and that we have with him an intimate love relationship. Says it best. What does Jesus do? How does he relate to doing the will of God? How does he relate to us? Through an intimate love relationship. Where does that get its energy? Where does this relationship start? Well, Paul wrote to the Galatian church and he said, I think it's 4:7 or 5:7. I'm not good at numbers, but I know the verse. Says that faith works, gets its energy, is motivated by, is fueled by love. Faith works by love. And love, well, let me put it this way. I can trust someone who I know loves me. I can trust someone who I know loves me. I'm going to take a commercial break here because this is an opportunity for me to do this in a public setting. My wife and I trusted each other implicitly. Why? Because we knew that we loved each other unconditionally. That generated trust. Now here's a commercial break for all of you. I just want to say thank you to all of you. This is my first time back in a public speaking event since the first of the year. And as many of you know, I lost my wife March 1st, and you have all been so kind. This is my commercial break, a thank you. You have all been so kind to me. You've been gracious, you've been kind, you've looked out for me, you've had me over for dinner, you've taken me fishing, you paid my mortgage. No, I'm just teasing on that one, but you have been very kind to me, and I honestly, I'm weeping inside with gratitude for all of you. Thank you so very, very much. Now, end of commercial break. See, when faith works by love, the next step is, oh, God, I don't want to do my will, I want to do your will. And Jesus Christ, in serving the will of God, served us. So the doulos of God actually really became the doulos of men. Not that we own him, but his relationship to us to lay down his life for us gives us this love response. I love the songs we sang this morning because they all spoke about this. Not some emotional, mushy thing, but this deep, objective, intelligent love that comes from trusting this Jesus Christ. Now, where there's a slave, there has to be a master. Correct? Makes sense. Logical. The slave-master, I never could talk well. The slave-master relationship is one that has, it's just that. It has a relational aspect to it. The two work together. Without one, there's not the other. Let me give you a little idea about this, how it worked in different cultures, because I think this is important to remove the negative connotation if you have one. In first century Roman culture, the slave had 0 rights. 0, none. If I'm a slave in the Roman culture and my master is a hard, cruel, despicable man, my life is not going to be easy. Tough enough as it is, but if I have to deal with that, if the master had a little bit of, personality, some semblance of kindness, even though I'm still a slave and life is not easy, it's going to be a little better because of the character of the one who owns me. In Roman culture, a slave could be killed at the drop of a hat. No questions asked. Now, move up to the Greek culture. Remember, they're living in these cultures of that day, both in the New Testament and, of course, in Jesus' time with the Romans. In the Greek culture, slaves were property. They were owned. They were below servants. Servants had some rights, but not the rights of citizens. So in the pecking order, down at the bottom, the most despicable person in the Greek culture was the slave. He's at the very bottom. You want to insult someone, call him a doulos. Highest insult you could pay in the Greek culture. Servants were less than human. The next up in the pecking order were servants. They had some rights, and I think I said that earlier. But at the top were the citizens. So that's the sandwich there in the Greek culture. They were property. But in the Hebrew world, in the mindset of God's people, and in the mindset of God, slaves were owned, but they were not property. That sounds a little strange. They were owned, but they weren't property. What do I mean by that? Well, sometimes they were captives taken in war. Sometimes children born into a slave family, obviously they became slaves. Sometimes they were indentured, and I picked on someone this morning, and I'll pick on someone today. All right, let's say that Rick owes Michael. I'll pick on you. I'll pick on you. You'll like this. You're going to be the boss. Let's say that Rick owes Michael whatever. Who knows? I mean, we'll just pick out a figure. 62 cents. I don't know. Well, Rick could not pay it, so Rick indentures himself, makes himself a slave of Michael. I'm sorry. He's a pretty good guy. He's a pretty good guy. He's got a soft heart. You be good. So what happens is Rick will work as a slave, an indentured bondservant for Michael for at least 6 years. And Pastor Burnside brought this up Wednesday night in the message on Nehemiah, where there was a bondservant arrangement. Well, so Rick is now under the authority of Michael for at least 6 years. So when do you want this to start? Okay, you guys can work it out, all right? He's under the authority of Michael. And so this relationship is formed where Rick is a slave and Michael is the master. Master Mike, I like it. It works very well. But he's under the authority of Michael. That does not mean that Rick has no status, no rights, no value, no worth, no dignity. In the Hebrew mindset, just the opposite. And if we would take the time to go through what happens if a slave is abused, you'd be pretty amazed. You'd be very amazed at the value that God placed on a slave. Slave had dignity, slave had rights, they had worth, even if they were indentured. So, at the end of, well, let me back up a little bit. I'm going to go back to Hebrews 10 for a second. Remember we read this in 5 through 7, a body was prepared for me, and I have come to do your will as it is written in the scriptures. And we said that relates back to Psalm 40, verse 6, a body you have fitted for me. Well, there's a nuance, and again, I'm bringing out nuances today. I'm not doing a deep exegetical study. That's not the point of my message. The nuance is that word body fitted for me in the Septuagint, the Greek translation, says that my ears were dug out. Now, I don't mean like earwax, things like that. I don't mean that. The idea is my ears were formed. They were dug out. They were formed to hear what the Father has said, so that I, Jesus says, can do his will and follow it through as the pattern of my life. Now back to Rick and Mike. 6 years are up. Mike says, Rick, you can go free. It's done. And Rick says, well, you know what? I have a wife and kids. You have treated me very well. You have loved me. You have almost treated me as an equal, even though I know what's going on here. May I remain a slave in your household until the day I die. And Michael says, yes, because I love you. You are like family to me. So he takes Rick over to a doorpost, and we'll pretend this is a doorpost, and he takes the lobe of his ear, puts it up against the doorpost, and drives an awl, an A-W-L, like an ice pick, drives it through his ear into that wood, and that hole in the ear signified to everyone that this man loves this master. And so all of those verses fit together to make a point that there is a voluntary submission to the authority that has been placed over the slave. In a parent-child relationship, maybe you have not done this, I don't know, but I remember my mother giving me a tongue lashing when I was a kid, and I'm going, yeah. But inside, I'm standing up and going, no. You know what I mean? But the voluntary in the inside goes, yes. Maybe the outside isn't quite what it should be, but on the inside there is, I'd be stupid. Bad word, we don't use the S word. I'd be foolish to leave this relationship. This relationship has given me meaning and purpose. Now, at the same time, fast forwarding to the New Testament, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6, verses 19 and 20, and Pastor Kelly brought this up last week, that we are owned. Jesus bought us. It says we are not our own, we are bought with a price. The word bought, I wished I had the time this morning, that is amazing word study to go into the word bought. The idea, and Pastor Kelly's going to do this in a couple of weeks, I think. It means to be purchased out of the slave market of sin. But the word I want you to look at is the word price. We are not our own. We don't belong to ourselves. We belong to another. We are bought with a price. The word price is the Greek word for honor / value. It's spelled T-I-M-E, but it's pronounced time. In other words, Paul writes here that we are not our own. We are bought with honor. We are bought with value. What does that mean? It means that Jesus considered two things: the will of the Father and the value of the items purchased. Us. The items purchased. Us. The value of the items purchased. I'll say it again. Us. Combined with the value of the Father's will, in his mind, it was the purchasing us with his blood was the only option available because of the value that he placed on those two things. We were bought with honor. Let that sink into your heart for a minute. We say, well, you were this, or you were that, or you had this problem. No. No. We're all sinners. We're all people. We're all in the same boat. We're all messed up somewhere along the line. Sorry, but we are. And Jesus looks at us and says, oh my gosh, I see such value. I see myself. I created them in my own image. I am going to buy them back. And I am going to pay the highest possible price. Why? Because I am a slave to my master's will. That's the perspective that Jesus wants us to have. That makes him the rightful master of anyone who follows him. What is the character? Well, if we go back to Philippians 2, to the mirror images there of how Jesus is and how we are to be, we see that he lived his life out in forgiveness, in sacrificial love, in forbearance. It means God waits a long time before he acts or reacts. He lives out immeasurable grace. He gives a mercy that knows no height and no depth. This master doesn't record. Get a load of this. My brain, after 40 years of stumbling along with God, some people say walking with God, I'm still stumbling. After 40 years, I still have to think about this. He does not record one sin or failure of the rebellious slave. Not one. Not one. Doesn't even remember it. Doesn't go to his record books at the end of the day. And Michael doesn't go to the record books and say, well, Rick, you screwed up here and you screwed up there and you screwed up here and you didn't do this and you didn't do that. Never happens. Why? Because of the honor. Here's the full picture of the truth of redemption. If we are believers in Jesus Christ and his gospel, we have been bought, paid for, and released from the slave market of sin and the curse and the power of the law. And I'm going to get to this in a minute. This is very important in our perspective of the master, is how we respond and live as bond slaves. Jesus says we are free. But there's a nuance there. We are bought out of, set free, but we are not bought into another form of that kind of slavery. We are set free now to choose. Now, I accepted Christ as my Savior, but I didn't choose to follow him till a few years later. There comes a point where I know I have this freedom to say, yes, Lord, I will love to be your slave, your doulos, understanding the connotation of that. I don't know what to do, how to do it. I have this problem, I have that problem, I have this weakness, I fall into that sin, but I want to pattern my life after the pattern that you followed your father from. That's what the freedom that we now have is. I'm not free just to be floating around on a tether somewhere. I am now free to choose who I will serve and why I will serve him. I have limitations as a slave. I've already brought this up. I have a propensity to sin. I disobey the Bible on a regular basis. It's part of who we are as people. We're wired naturally to follow the world. And might I say this, another little commercial break, and what we're dealing with internationally in the culture of the world today, with the continued oppression on Christians and the removal of the rights that people are entitled to, it's so important that we get this principle down. Who are we going to serve? First message Pastor Kelly preached was, I am a Christian. Says a lot. So this is a very important principle to start to meditate upon, because the times are coming where we will have to make some choices, I'm sure. I don't know when that is, but this is so important. We can put on a good show in the flesh. What is that? That's an old church term. It means I can fake it. I can do it my own power. I can be a church person. I can do this. I can do that. I can do anything I want to put my mind to. That's a good show in the flesh, but it's not the same as serving out of love. Jesus is not interested in performance. If you'll go away with one thing this morning, especially if you're new to Grace Connection, you visited a few times, you're not quite sure where we're coming from, this is where we're coming from. We serve by love. We serve God out of love for him. Granted, we have to learn that. We serve each other out of love. I had a lady come up this morning, third time here, and she says, this is such a loving church. I said, thank you. That's what it's all about. If church is not a safe grace place, why bother? So this is who we are. And if I have time, I'm going to get into that a little bit at the end. Jesus is interested in character, not performance. Not talking perfection, we're talking heart. What is Jesus saying? My son, my daughter, would you give me your heart? I know there's a lot of things attached to it. I know that. I'm God. I can see the beginning from the end. I got that down. But would you give me your heart? After all, in Galatians 4:7, you're not a slave to the law of performance anymore. You're a son. And I love John 15:15. Jesus says this, and it sort of gums up the works a little bit. He said, I don't call you slaves anymore. Oh, you're slaves. But I don't call you slaves anymore. I call you my friends. Because the master doesn't tell the slave the intimate secrets of the household, but the parent tells the child what the child, the parent tells the friend, I got my metaphors mixed up. The friend tells the friend the secrets of his heart. And the parent tells the child what that child needs to know in order to function in the household. So it's all about character. We serve by love, not out of duty or fear or pride. Serves with the character of the master because he recognizes the value and dignity that both have. He takes what one writer called humble nobility as his marker. I have humble nobility given to me by the master. A bondslave has in Philippians 1:20 this perspective, slave eyes. It doesn't say slave eyes, but there's a perspective given there, and I'm calling it slave eyes. Paul said, my goal in life is to make sure that Jesus Christ is magnified in my body, whether in life or in death. That's my perspective. I know who he is. I know how he treats me. I know what his character is. He's not looking for me to perform. He doesn't have a list of to-dos and to-don'ts. He has love that he implants in my heart that causes me to respond, and I can't help but want to do, oh, Jesus, take me to the doorpost. Drive the awl through my ear. This is a life commitment. I'm not going to be perfect. I'll mess up. I'll be a rebellious slave at times, but I have a reminder of whose I am. I want to bring up a term that maybe you've heard as we transition into the close of the message. And it's the term legalism. Many people have been in situations where they served out of duty. You won't find the term legalism in the Bible, but it carries the idea of having a performance-based duty and not having a life that's animated by grace, because maybe we see God as a hard taskmaster instead of a loving and just and righteous master. A grace slave, I'm just throwing these little words out, a grace slave doesn't serve from legal obedience. What does that mean? Here's a little working definition of legalism, and we'll be done in just a few minutes. Legalism is the preoccupation with form at the expense of substance. Legalism puts law above gospel and establishes requirements for following God. Maybe you've been in situations you can sort of put your own definition in here, your own experience. It's an overemphasis on the discipline of conduct and ignorance of the grace of God. I'm just reading this definition here. It emphasizes the letter of the law or a man-made standard at the expense of the Spirit. Legalism implies this, that if you obey the law, we'll call it the Ten Commandments, it's a little bigger than that, but if you obey the law, if you follow narrow and rigid moral codes, oftentimes standardized by men, and that's how you become like Christ. It's not faith in God's grace. It is performance out of fear, out of the need for affirmation, out of the need for love attention, and not by grace. I'm going to throw a screen up here for you to look at that I think says it very, very well. And this is a paragraph, I don't remember where I got it, so I can't give credit where it's due, but it didn't come from me. I'm not smart enough to use some of these words. Imperatives flow from indicatives. We obey by faith when we see all of who Jesus is in any given situation, trust him to be faithful in that situation, and then act as if he will be faithful. Gosh, can you believe that? I'm going to act like he's going to be faithful? Yeah, because I trust him to be. Remember, I can trust someone who loves me. That is, we act on our faith in who he is. You will find that connected to every command in the Scripture is some kind of reference to who God is and what he can be trusted for. Seeing the connection between what God can be trusted for and what he then directs us to do generates the obedience of grace through faith. Every imperative of grace, every command of grace, every imperative of grace is built on a foundation of an indicative of grace. Indicative means certainty. So every command of grace is built on the certainty of grace. The reason there is always a connection is because all of God's commands to us, the imperatives, arise out of his own character. He can't give me something outside of himself. He can't demand something apart from who he is. They arise out of his own character, his heart, his nature, and his purpose, including everything he has done for us in Jesus Christ. That's the indicative, the certainty. God is not arbitrary. His will for us is always informed and controlled by his nature. He cannot act outside of being God, is what that means. It's always informed and controlled by his nature and character as a triune God who came to us in Jesus Christ that we might have fellowship and communion with him in holy love. Now, may I say this? That's our philosophy here at Grace Connection Church. Now, I'm going to do a little. Pastor Kelly's not here. I have no idea if he's watching. I hope not. But since he's not here, I'm going to talk about him a little bit. Because in order to know the kind of church that you go to, it's important to know the kind of shepherd. Our relationship as Christians to God is based on the character of the one who we follow, Christ. In a local setting, the shepherd sets the tone. And I want to say to you, if you don't know Pastor Kelly that well, that this man lives and breathes what I just read all the time. I wished you were here today, so if you're new here, you could meet him, but hopefully next week or the next time you are so inclined to return. But he is a man that in public, behind closed doors, over coffee, in his office, it makes no difference who he's talking to, there is always this indicative of grace, the certainty of grace that he treats everyone with based on the imperatives of grace, how Jesus commands us to live towards him and towards each other. We are a grace hospital. Our slave friend here, Rick, loves that term. We are a grace hospital. I talk to people. My role here is I'm a connection pastor. I spend a lot of time visiting people, putting people together, helping people build relationships. And I hear this all the time. How come I haven't heard this before? Oh, I hear grace here, but how come I haven't heard it as a consistent message of living the Christian life, of being a bond slave to my master? And I don't know the answer to that. And I'm not saying we're better than any other church. I'm not saying we're the only. I'm not saying any of that. We are a one another church. We co-labor with everyone. We love everyone. But for some reason, God has blessed our pastor with this message and has worked it out in his life over the years, many, many stories to illustrate that, so that in his mind, there is only one way to live, and that's that he serves God with us. In fact, let me read it to you. I think this verse, and we'll close with this, says it the best. This is about the pastor at the church in Colossia. His name was Epaphras. This is Colossians 4:12. Paul writes, Epaphras, which means lovely man, A man with character and dignity. That's what the word means, his name. Who is one of you? You know what I love about Pastor Kelly? I don't normally talk about people, and this is not flattery. I just want to do this morning. He is one of us. He's one of us. That word means he has the same point of origin. He comes from the same place. He's one of us. A slave, Epaphras, a slave of Christ. It says he always labors fervently for you in prayers that you may stand perfect, and get a load of this, and complete in all the will of God. That, I put Pastor Kelly's name in there in a heartbeat. Labors for us in prayer, labors for us to understand the will of God, labors for us to love one another, labors for us to serve together. And we have a staff member here, and that staff member told us recently that they had been in other places around over the years, and they said it's so refreshing to be in a church where there are no politics. Why? The indicatives and the imperatives of grace being worked out in a person's life. So I just want to say thank you again for putting yourself in a place where you can absorb the ministry and the environment of grace. No one's perfect. No one does everything right. We are all human beings, but we have, as a congregation, we want to grow in having slave eyes, having the right perspective of our master. Would you bow your heads as the band comes up to close in a final song?